The recording was 11 seconds long. That was the first thing Admiral Vetsara noted when the file appeared in her command queue. Not its content, not its origin coordinates, not the fact that it had been broadcast on every frequency the human species was capable of producing simultaneously. 11 seconds. She had reviewed 10,000 first contact transmissions in her career, spanning 4 decades of convergence diplomatic service. The shortest had been 43 seconds. The longest had run for 6 standard hours. 11 seconds was not a greeting. 11 seconds was not a warning in any format her species had ever catalogued. 11 seconds was something else entirely. She pressed play. What came out of the speaker was not language. It was not music. It was a single human voice, female, by the tonal analysis, speaking 4 words in the dominant terrestrial dialect, followed by 7 seconds of complete silence. 4 words, 7 seconds of silence. Her translator rendered the phrase instantly. "We know you're coming." Then nothing. Then the transmission looped and started again. The convergence fleet had been in system for 9 hours before the transmission reached them, which meant the humans had sent it while the fleet was still decelerating through the outer debris field. Before any conventional sensor array on the planet's surface should have been able to confirm their presence with certainty. The humans had needed to aim this broadcast at a specific vector through a cluttered solar system, and they had aimed it correctly, to within 0.003 degrees of the fleet's actual approach angle. They should not have been able to do that. Vetsara pulled up the sensor logs and read them twice. The fleet had maintained full emission suppression since crossing the heliopause. No communication, no active scanning. The humans had seen something the instruments said was invisible, aimed at it with precision that bordered on uncomfortable, and then sent 4 words in 7 seconds of deliberate silence. 3 questions formed in her mind simultaneously, and she noted with professional discipline that she did not have answers to any of them. The first, how had they known? The second, why 4 words in silence instead of anything else? The third, and this one she turned over more carefully, because it carried a weight she couldn't immediately name. Why had the voice sounded completely calm? Fleet Liaison Morin. She didn't raise her voice. On the bridge of the undying patience asterisk, she never needed to. Her second stepped forward. Young, by Sarith standards, barely 60 cycles. He had the particular alertness of someone who had already played the transmission 3 times without being told to. "Admiral, pull everything we have on human communication psychology. I want to know what silence means to them." He paused just barely. Silence. 7 seconds of it, deliberate, after 4 words. She set the data slate down. "That's not a malfunction. Find out what they intended." He left it something close to a run, which was itself unusual. Morin was not easily unsettled. She watched him go and turned back to the forward display, where the third planet hung blue and white and infuriatingly quiet, and thought about the fact that somewhere down there, a species that had never left its own solar system had just told a convergence fleet of 47 warships that it had been watching them come. The convergence had not come to conquer. That distinction mattered enormously to Vetsara, and she suspected it would matter not at all to the humans, because, in her experience, species that had never encountered others never believed the first visitors' stated intentions regardless of evidence. This was rational behavior. She did not hold it against them. What the convergence had come to do was assess. The word had a clinical comfort to it that she'd long since stopped examining too carefully. Assess meant determine resource value, sociological complexity index, potential threat rating, and integration timeline. Assess was the step before a dozen other steps that varied wildly depending on outcomes. The humans had a complexity index that had already surprised 3 separate survey teams. They had achieved industrialization, global communication networks, and rudimentary spaceflight capability in a period of time that the Convergence's own developmental models classified as statistically improbable, not impossible, but the sort of thing that triggered a second look. Hence the fleet of 47 ships, rather than the standard diplomatic trio. Hence, Vetsara understood now the transmission. They sent it before we crossed the inner system boundary, her navigation officer said from the far side of the bridge, not looking up from his console. I've run the timing 4 times. They broadcast that message while we were still beyond detection range for any sensor technology in their known catalog. Known catalog, Vetsara repeated. Yes, Admiral, known. She let the words sit in the air between them. The second mystery arrived 6 hours later, in a form no one on the bridge had anticipated. The humans transmitted again. This time the transmission was not 4 words. It was 41 minutes of dense, structured data, mathematics, biology, atmospheric chemistry, stellar cartography, the standard elements of any first contact package, assembled with a sophistication that suggested they'd been preparing it for some time. Morin brought the analysis to her personally. Admiral, the package is technically accurate, impressively so. He set the slate on the arm of her command chair, but there's an anomaly in the stellar cartography section. She looked, they've mapped our home system. Partially, 14 of the 22 inner planets, correctly positioned, correctly sized, within acceptable margin of error. He was doing the thing he did when something genuinely disturbed him, which was speaking more precisely than the situation required. They should not have been able to obtain that data. Our home system is 612 light-years from here. How old is their oldest observatory data? Their optical telescope records go back approximately 80 years, at 612 light-years. The light from our system that reached their telescopes 80 years ago shows our system as it was over 6 centuries ago. She understood the mathematics perfectly. So either their data is coincidentally approximate, or someone gave it to them. He met her eyes. And there is a third possibility, Admiral, that I want to flag formally so that it exists in the record. Go on. The cartography is accurate to present-day positioning, not 600-year-old positioning. Accounting for stellar drift over 6 centuries, the error introduced would be measurable with their technology. He paused. There is no error. She was quiet for a moment. So they have information about our current system that could not have arrived here via light-speed observation. Yes. And we don't know how. No. She picked up the data slate and read through the cartography section again, slowly, while Morin stood and waited and the bridge ran quiet around them. Then she set it down. Add it to the anomaly file, she said, and increase passive sensor sweep radius by 40%. Here is what Vetsara knew about humanity, distilled from 3 years of long-range study before this mission had been authorized. They were young, cosmologically embarrassingly young, a species that had been using written language for less than 6,000 years, which placed them in approximately the 3rd percentile of civilizations the Convergence had cataloged in terms of developmental age. Their technology was, by any reasonable interstellar standard, primitive. Their fastest spacecraft took years to cross distances that Convergence vessels crossed in days. Their weapons were energetic but short-ranged. Their communications were sophisticated within their own system, but essentially deaf to the broader galaxy. They had not achieved unity. They ran as somewhere between 200 and 250 separate political entities. The count fluctuated, many of which were actively hostile to each other. They had spent the majority of their recorded history in conflict with themselves. By every standard metric the Convergence used to assess per-contact civilizations, humanity scored in the lower quartile. Except one. The metric was informal. It didn't appear in the official assessment framework because it had been proposed only once, by a survey analyst who had spent 6 years studying humanity and then retired early, citing, in her exit documentation, a feeling she described as *sustained unexplainable unease. The metric was this: of all species the Convergence had catalogued, humanity was the only one whose rate of self-directed change, cultural, technological, biological self-modification, had never plateaued. Every other species, upon reaching industrial complexity, had shown a natural deceleration curve. Not humanity. Their rate of change had accelerated continuously for 3 centuries. The retired analyst had written, in a footnote that most of her colleagues had found melodramatic, "We are watching something learn how to become something else. We do not know what it is becoming." Vetsara had read that footnote 7 times. 17 hours into the approach, the third message arrived. Not a broadcast. A directed, encrypted, tight beam signal aimed directly at the undying patience, specifically at the undying patience *, which was not the largest ship in the fleet, not the most visually distinct, and was not flying in a command position that should have been identifiable from the surface. And this one was in Sareth, her language, not a translation, not reconstructed from first principles. Native grammar Sareth, with correct idiomatic register and the specific formal honorific that one used when addressing a flag officer of the Convergence Admiralty. A human voice, different from the first, male, speaking her language with the accent of someone who had learned it from recordings rather than from a native speaker, but speaking it correctly. Admiral Vetsara, we are not asking you to leave because we are afraid. Please understand that distinction before you respond. She did not move for a long moment. Around her, the bridge had gone very still. "They know my name," she said, and her voice came out perfectly level, and she was professionally proud of that. "Yes, Admiral," Morin said. "They know my name, they know my ship, they know our language, they know our stellar cartography, and they knew we were coming before we were visible." She folded her hands. "What don't they know, Morin?" He opened his mouth, closed it, tried again. "I don't know, Admiral." "Neither do I," she said, "and that troubles me considerably more than anything else that has happened today." She transmitted a response. It took her 40 minutes to compose 11 words, which she considered a reasonable investment of time. "We are here to speak. We are willing to listen. What are the terms?" The reply came back in 4 minutes. "Come alone. 1 ship. Land at the coordinates attached to this transmission. Bring the person who decides what humans are worth." Morin read the translation over her shoulder. Then quietly, that last phrase, "the person who decides what humans are worth." That's a very precise understanding of what an assessment mission is. "Yes," Vetsara said. "How do they?" "I don't know." She was already standing. "Prep my shuttle and tell the fleet to hold position. Full emission suppression. No active countermeasures. If something happens to me, they are to do nothing until they receive an authorization code from Convergence Command." Morin turned to look at her directly. "Admiral, with respect, that last part." "I know. That means if something happens to you. It means the fleet does nothing rash before command can be consulted, yes." She was moving toward the exit. "This is a first contact situation, Morin. The consequences of a mistake here are not recoverable. The consequences of my personal removal from this situation are recoverable. Maintain that hierarchy." He was quiet for a beat too long. Then, "Understood, Admiral." She left without looking back, because if she had looked back, she might have seen something in his expression that would have made the next part harder, and she needed the next part to be straightforward. The coordinates placed her in a valley on the continent the humans called North America, forests dense enough to block her shuttle's exterior sensors from reading more than 30 meters. Temperature within survivable parameters for her physiology, barely. The air was breathable with filtration. She stepped out of the shuttle alone, as instructed. A human was already there, sitting on a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing, drinking from a container and watching her land with the expression of someone who had been waiting without particular impatience. He was older. She had studied enough human biology to read the surface markers. Gray in his hair, lines around his eyes. He was wearing civilian clothing, which she had not expected, and he was alone, which she also had not expected, and he was doing the one thing she would never have predicted. Nothing, he was simply sitting there, waiting. She stopped 5 meters from him. "You're not a government official," she said, in his language. She had spent the shuttle descent reviewing what she knew. "No," he said. "You're not military." "Retired." He took another drink. "Sit down if you want, the log's stable." She did not sit down. "Who sent the transmissions?" "I did." "How do you know my name?" He looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Admiral, I've been tracking your fleet for 3 years. You've been tracking us for longer. Seemed only fair to return the favor." He paused. "Also, I broke your communication encryption about 14 months ago. I've been reading your internal traffic." She absorbed this. "You've been reading your fleet orders, your assessment reports, your integration timeline." He said it without particular emphasis, the way one might mention having read a newspaper. "That's how I knew which ship you were on. You sent a personal message to your second-in-command about the stellar cartography anomaly 20 minutes after you saw our data package. I wanted you to see that. I wanted you to understand that we knew you were watching." She was quiet for what felt like a long time but was probably 4 seconds. "Why?" He set the container down on the log beside him. "Because I needed you to come down here alone," he said. "And the only way to make that happen was to make you afraid of the thing you didn't understand, instead of the thing you were planning to do." The forest was very quiet around them. "What," she said carefully, "were we planning to do?" "The same thing you've done to 43 other pre-contact civilizations in the last 2 centuries, he said. "Arrive, assess, determine that we're below threshold complexity for full integration, classify us as a managed resource zone, and leave a monitoring installation that we'd never detect. That would prevent any of our spacecraft from reaching the inner convergence systems for the next 3 to 4 centuries until we've had more time to develop." He looked at her steadily. "You call it the Patience Protocol." She did not move. The Patience Protocol was a Level 7 classified designation. She was one of 41 individuals in the entire convergence who knew that name. "Your encryption," she said finally, "is considerably more thorough than I was led to believe." "It's not the encryption," he said. "It's that I've been listening to your ships talk to each other across this whole system for 3 years, and your assessment teams are, and I mean this with respect, not as careful as they think they are. They assumed we couldn't hear them, so they got comfortable." Something cold settled in her chest. "You said the transmission was not about fear." "It wasn't." "Then what was it?" He stood up, which brought him to roughly her eye level. Humans were taller than she'd expected, up close, and he said very simply, "It was a test." She waited. "I needed to know," he said, "whether you were the kind of person who would come alone when told to, because only one kind of admiral does that." "And what kind is that?" "The kind who actually wants to talk." He held out his hand in the gesture her files identified as an offer of physical greeting. "My name is Jonas Verl. I was a cryptographer, then I was a linguist, and then I was a problem that my government didn't have a good category for. I've been preparing for this conversation for 11 years. She looked at his hand, she looked at him. Then she reached out and took it. What Jonas Verl told her over the next 4 hours in that forest valley restructured everything she thought she understood about the previous 24 hours, and several things she thought she understood about the previous 3 years. He had not been working alone. That was the first revision. There were, by his account, somewhere between 300 and 400 humans scattered across the planet who had been doing various pieces of this work. Linguists, mathematicians, astrophysicists, cryptographers, operating without any government mandate, funded through a network of private means that had taken considerable ingenuity to assemble. They had no official standing. They had no institutional authority. They were, as Jonas put it with a faint trace of what she was beginning to recognize as dry amusement, aggressively unofficial. They had been watching the convergence for 11 years, not with the technology listed in the human catalog, with technology that wasn't in the catalog, because they had built it specifically for this purpose and told no one. Modified arrays, novel signal processing architectures, techniques that Jonas described in terms that her translation matrix handled adequately, but that she suspected lost something in the conversion. They had cracked the convergence's encrypted traffic not through computational brute force, but through 11 years of pattern analysis, cross-referencing. And this was the word Jonas used, intuition asterisk, which her translator rendered correctly, and which she found deeply unsatisfying as an explanation. "That's not a method," she said. "It's how cryptography actually works," he said. "At the edge of what's possible, intuition and method become the same thing." She wrote that down because she didn't want to forget it, and because something about it felt important in a way she couldn't fully articulate. The stellar cartography had not come from Convergence Communications traffic. He told her this directly when she asked, and she watched his face when he said it. No, the coordinates had been derived from 90 years of cumulative optical observation, run through a predictive model for stellar drift that had taken a mathematician named. He gave her a name she couldn't pronounce, 7 years to develop. It was not perfect. It was accurate to within parameters that had made his team confident enough to include it. "You wanted us to think you had information you shouldn't have," she said. "I wanted you to not be certain that you understood all the things you didn't understand," he said. "There's a difference." She turned this over. "The silence," she said, 7 seconds after 4 words. He nodded as if he'd been waiting for this. "What did your people conclude about the silence?" "That it was deliberate, psychological, that you were demonstrating comfort with ambiguity or demonstrating patience, or," she paused. Morin thought it might be a dominant species behavioral signal, silence as an assertion of power, that you were letting us sit with the statement and feel it. Jonas was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "It was the satellite delay." She stared at him. "We bounced the signal off one of our weather satellites to hit your approach vector correctly," he said. "The delay is 7.2 seconds. I knew it would read as intentional." The faint trace of amusement again. "I decided not to correct that impression." This was the moment. She would recognize it later, reconstructing the day when the entire architecture of her understanding shifted. Every conclusion they had drawn, every note in the anomaly file, the stellar cartography, the encryption break, the language fluency, the directional accuracy of the first broadcast. She had been mentally assembling these into a picture of a species that was, despite its primitive metrics, operating at a level of coordinated sophistication that suggested hidden capability beyond anything their catalog reflected. Some of that picture was accurate. Some of it was a handful of very clever people exploiting the gap between what the convergence assumed humanity knew about itself and what humanity actually knew. And some of it, the stellar cartography, the 7-second silence, the impression of perfect directional aim, was accident and calculation, and the deliberate decision to let her draw the wrong conclusions and not correct them. The humans had not deceived her, not technically. They had said nothing false. They had simply provided her with facts and allowed the architecture of her own assumptions to construct a building that was larger and more fortified than the facts alone would have produced. "How much of it was real?" she asked. "Most of it," Jonas said. "The language, the encryption, the 3-year surveillance, the network, the preparation." He met her eyes. "We are exactly as capable as the things we actually demonstrated. We are not as mysterious as the things you assumed." But you let me assume. Yes. Why? He leaned back against the tree he'd returned to sitting on. Because you needed to come down here with respect already established, he said. Not because you were afraid of us, because you were uncertain about us. Those are different motivations and they produce different conversations. He paused. If you'd landed confident that you understood exactly what we were, you'd have landed already knowing what you planned to do. Uncertainty made you actually listen. She said nothing for a long moment. The forest moved around them, wind through leaves, a bird somewhere above making a sound her translator didn't try to render. The patient's protocol, she said finally. He nodded. You know what it does. I know what it's done to 43 other species, yes. And if I return to my fleet and proceed according to mandate, 3 to 4 centuries of invisible management, he said. Your monitoring installation will prevent us from reaching your inner systems. We'll spend those centuries wondering why our colony ships keep having navigation failures, and why we can never quite get the engine designs right, and why certain resource zones stay mysteriously out of reach. His voice stayed even. We'll think it's us. We'll think we're just not quite good enough yet. The cold feeling was back in her chest, but different now. Not the cold of surprise, a different temperature entirely. That is not how the protocol is described in its documentation, she said. I know how it's documented, he said. I read the documentation. She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. The bird made its sound again somewhere in the canopy. You came here alone, she said. No government authorization, no official mandate. If I report this conversation as unauthorized first contact initiated by a private citizen, your internal communications traffic for the next hour will be extremely interesting, he said, and then you'll have a decision to make. And if I report it accurately, that a retired cryptographer broke your encryption, surveilled your fleet for 3 years, and maneuvered a convergence admiral into an unauthorized private conversation by exploiting her own assumptions. Then Command will want to know how one human with a small network of colleagues cracked level 7 encryption and maintained 3-year undetected surveillance of an active assessment fleet. He paused, and the answer to that question might change how the convergence classifies us. She understood then what he'd actually done. Not the surveillance, not the encryption, not even the linguistic preparation or the careful orchestration of the approach. He had given her a report that she couldn't file honestly without triggering a classification review. He had given her a story that, told accurately, immediately invalidated the assumptions underlying the patient's protocol. He had backed her into a corner that was shaped exactly like a conversation she actually needed to have with Command. You planned this, she said. For 11 years, he said. You planned for this exact conversation. I planned for the conversation that would have to happen if every other part worked. The conversation where a convergence admiral had to decide whether to file an honest report. He was quiet for a beat. I planned for someone like you, someone who came alone when told to. The amusement in his voice had a different quality now, something underneath it. How many versions of this plan did you build? She asked. 12, he said. 11 of them required an admiral who would choose documentation accuracy over institutional comfort. He paused. You're the 3rd admiral I've orchestrated into this position. She went very still. What happened to the first 2? Something moved through his expression, the lines around his eyes. They filed accurate reports, he said. Both times. He looked at the ground for a moment. The first review took 4 years and ended with a revised threat classification that added 2 centuries to the patient's protocol timeline. The flatness in his voice was a kind of wound. The second resulted in a monitoring installation upgrade. He looked up. 8 years, he said. I lost 8 years to the first 2 attempts. People in my network gave up things you wouldn't understand for those attempts. We lost, he stopped. It doesn't matter what we lost. We started over. Why? The question came out before she decided to ask it. Because our children are going to live under whatever system exists when I'm dead, he said. And I have a particular feeling about the kind of system I want them to live under. The forest was very quiet. I have children, Vetsara said. It came out almost involuntarily. Grown, 2 of them. Jonas looked at her. I know, he said gently. I read 11 years of your career file. I chose you partly because of how you handled the Veth-6 humanitarian review. You wrote a dissent. She remembered the dissent. She remembered the cost of it. 6 months of reassignment to survey work, which was the Convergence's polite form of professional exile for people who filed unwelcome paperwork. You chose me, she said slowly, because I had already once told the institution something it didn't want to hear. And because you came alone, he said, yes. She filed her report that evening from the shuttle before she returned to the undying patient's asterisk. She filed it completely accurately, every detail of the conversation. The encryption breach, the 3-year surveillance, the failed first 2 approaches, the 11 years of preparation. She included Jonas Verrill's full name, his methodology, his network, and his assessment of the patient's protocol's actual effect on subject civilizations. She included her own assessment at the end, in the field marked Recommending Officer Evaluation. She wrote, "This species does not require patience. This species requires acknowledgement. They have been watching us longer than we have been comfortable watching them. They have broken our most secure communications architecture using methodology that is not in any catalog we maintain. They have, through the action of fewer than 400 private citizens with no government mandate, completely invalidated the operational assumptions underlying our standard approach protocol. I am recommending immediate suspension of protocol execution, pending full classification review. I am recommending this knowing the personal cost of that recommendation. I am recommending it because I was chosen in part, because I have made this kind of recommendation before. They are not primitives who need management. They are something we do not yet have accurate language for. That should concern the Convergence considerably. It concerns me. They sent us 11 seconds of transmission, 4 words, 7 seconds of silence that I spent 17 hours analyzing for hidden meaning. The silence was a satellite delay. I have been doing this work for 40 years. I have never felt this specifically embarrassed or this specifically interested in what happens next. She submitted the report and sat in the shuttle cockpit in the dark and looked at the blue-white planet through the forward view and thought about an analyst who had retired early and written a footnote that she'd read 7 times. We are watching something learn how to become something else. The classification review took 11 months. During those 11 months, the Convergence fleet remained in system, holding position per her orders. Vetsara was recalled to command for the first 6 months of the review process, which she had expected. Morin took command of the fleet in her absence, with specific instructions she'd spent 3 hours composing. The instructions said, in part, do not attempt to make sense of them by applying the metrics we normally use. Watch what they do, not what they measure as. Especially watch what they do when they believe no one is watching. She did not know if Morin followed this instruction. She was not there. What she knew, from the briefing documents that reached her during the review, was that in the 11 months the fleet held position above the planet, the humans launched 3 new satellites, completed construction of a deep space observation array that extended their sensory range by a factor of 11, published and globally distributed a complete guide to Sarith grammar and syntax compiled from Convergence communications traffic, openly, freely available, downloadable by anyone, and held what their records described as an international symposium on the question of whether the Convergence's governing structure was philosophically compatible with human concepts of informed consent. That last one got a great deal of attention in the review documents. The symposium had been attended, voluntarily, by representatives of over 80 of their political entities. It had produced no binding resolution. It had produced a 1,200-page document that had been translated into 41 human languages within a week, and that Vetsara read in its Sarith translation, which had been prepared by Jonas Veral's network and was, her linguistic staff confirmed, essentially flawless. The document was an argument, a very long, very thorough, philosophically dense argument for why the Convergence's model of assessing civilizations without their knowledge or consent was a moral problem that the Convergence should address on its own terms, using the Convergence's own philosophical traditions, many of which the document quoted correctly and in context. They had read the Convergence's own philosophical texts. They had used them to write a case against Convergence policy. The review board's reaction to this was varied in ways that made for interesting reading. The classification review ended with a revised designation. The Convergence did not have, in its existing framework, a category for what humanity appeared to be. They created one. The designation was long in Sarith and translated, somewhat awkwardly, as *anomalous developmental acceleration with persistent attention, hazard *, which Vetsara privately thought was the most bureaucratically uncomfortable compliment she'd ever seen formally recorded. It meant, we don't understand the rate of what's happening here, and we have decided that not understanding it warrants closer attention of a different kind. The patient's protocol was suspended, not abandoned, suspended, pending further review, pending a proposal that Vetsara had submitted separately, whose title she'd chosen carefully. The proposal was called A Framework for Contact on Terms Both Parties Can Actually Remember Agreeing to. She'd been told it was the longest proposal title in Convergence diplomatic history. She'd chosen to take that as a compliment. She returned to Earth 14 months after her first shuttle landing. Different season, the valley had bare trees now, and the air was colder, and the fallen log was still there. Jonas Veral was not sitting on it. He was standing near the shuttle's landing zone with his hands in his pockets, looking considerably older than 14 months should have made him, and accompanied by a woman Vetsara didn't recognize, who was introduced simply as Myra, and who had the particular quality of someone who had been awake too long for too many consecutive days and had decided not to care about that anymore. Myra ran the communications array for the whole operation, Jonas said. She should have been here the first time. Myra looked at Vetsara with dark, evaluating eyes. You came back, she said. I came back, Vetsara said. With better news than the first 2 times. Considerably. Myra was quiet for a moment. Then she turned to Jonas and said, with a flatness that Vetsara had by now learned to read as the human register for deep emotion being held very carefully in check, 11 years. He nodded. Say it out loud, Myra said. I want to hear it out loud. He looked at the valley, at the trees, at the sky where a Convergence fleet was visible, if you knew exactly where to look, as a slightly wrong kind of light among the stars. The protocol is suspended, he said. They're going to talk to us like, he stopped, like we're here. Myra pressed her lips together, said nothing, looked away into the tree line. We lost a lot of people to this, she said very quietly, along the way. I know. Not to violence, she said, which Vetsara understood was clarifying something for her benefit. To the first 2 attempts, people who gave years of their lives and watched it fail, people who burned out, people who, she stopped. It matters that it worked, but it would have mattered to them to know that. I know, Jonas said again, and something in his voice had the particular quality of having said that phrase to himself so many times it had become its own kind of ritual. Vetsara looked at both of them. She looked at the valley and the bare trees and the fallen log and the sky. The proposal I submitted, she said, the framework, it will require human signatories, official ones. which creates a problem given that your governments were not part of this. We're working on that, Jonas said. Are you? We've been working on it for about 8 months. The faint trace of amusement. It turns out telling your government that a private citizen broke alien encryption and maneuvered a review of classified alien policy on their behalf without asking it produces a complicated reaction. Multiple complicated reactions, Myra said dryly, simultaneously, from people who can't agree on what to do with them. But they're talking, Jonas said, all of them 200 and he paused. Roughly 250, they're talking. Vetsara thought about that. 250 entities. No unity. A history composed mostly of conflict. And yet 11 months after an unofficial first contact that none of them had authorized, they were talking to each other about what to do next. Is that unusual? She asked. For your species, getting that many of your entities to talk simultaneously about the same thing. Jonas and Myra looked at each other. Yes, Myra said. Historically, yes, Jonas said. Usually it takes a catastrophe. What would you call this? Vetsara asked. Jonas turned back to the sky, to the wrong kind of light that was 47 convergence warships holding position and waiting. An opening, he said. The formal first contact happened 4 months later. It was not in a forest valley. It was in a building designed specifically for the purpose by an architect who had, Vetsara was told, never designed anything political before and had therefore approached it as purely a problem of acoustics and light, which resulted in a room that a great many people found unexpectedly difficult to be dishonest in, and which became, in time, the location of 17 subsequent agreements whose quality was attributed by various parties to various things, none of which were the architecture. Vetsara was there. Jonas was there, in an unofficial capacity that had taken 3 months of diplomatic maneuvering to make technically possible. Myra was running communications from a room 2 floors up, which was where she said she preferred to be and which everyone accepted because by that point she had been running communications through more difficult circumstances than this for 11 years and had opinions about her workspace. The agreements took 4 days. They were imperfect. They would be revised. They contained 17 clauses that were deliberately vague because no party could agree on precise language, and 4 clauses that were accidentally vague because translation is hard, and 2 clauses that Vetsara privately believed neither side actually intended to honor, but that both sides needed to be on record supporting. This, her experience told her, was what functioning agreements actually looked like. The Convergence's official assessment report on the contact, filed afterward by Vetsara and ratified after 8 further months of internal review, contained a sentence in its summary that she had written and rewritten 14 times before she was satisfied with it. It read, "Humanity is not best understood as a primitive civilization in early development. Humanity is best understood as a species currently in the act of deciding what it intends to be, at a speed that makes prediction functionally unreliable and assessment by static metric operationally unsound. All future engagement recommendations should account for the probability that any accurate description of this species will require revision within a decade of its filing." She had written that last line and then sat with it for a long time. It was not a comfortable thing to put in an official document. It was not the kind of language the Convergence's assessment framework was built to accommodate. It would require the creation of new categories, new review cycles, new methods. She filed it anyway. There is a recording in the Convergence's contact archive, now, from the night before the formal proceedings began. It was captured by a monitoring system that both sides had agreed to, and that was running passive audio in a corridor outside the main hall. Jonas, Verl, and Myra. Her full name was Myra Solano, and she had been a signals engineer before she was a revolutionary, and she would be neither description after this. Were sitting on the floor of the corridor at 2 in the morning, which was a thing they were doing because the chairs inside were formal, and they had been formal for 11 years, and they needed 40 minutes of not being formal. The audio is clear enough to hear what they said. "Do you think it'll hold?" Myra asked. "The agreement, parts of it." "Which parts?" "The parts both sides are embarrassed to be caught violating." A pause, the sound of something, a container probably. The satellite delay was not a factor this time. "That's your theory of international relations," Myra said. "Mutual embarrassment. I have found it to be remarkably durable." Another pause. "Jonas." "The first attempt, 11 years ago, when we started." "I know. I need to say it." He was quiet. "I was 26 years old," she said, "and you told me it was going to work. You told me specifically. You looked me in the eye and you said, 'This will work.' I know I did. And I believed you, and I came with you, and it did not work for 11 years. And a lot of things happened in those 11 years that I will not fully describe because this corridor has monitoring, and I have a professional reputation to maintain." "Myra." "And I want you to tell me," she said, "whether you actually believed it when you said it, when you looked at me and said this will work. Did you believe that?" The recording runs for 6 seconds after the question. Jonas Verrill's voice, when it comes back, is different from every other recording in the archive. Quieter. The quality of someone saying a thing they have been holding for a very long time. "I believed," he said, "that it had to work. I believed that it would be worse if we didn't try than if we tried and failed. I believed that if we kept going, eventually the right admiral would come alone. I believed," a pause. "I believed that humans are the kind of thing that keeps going. I believed that's what we are. I had to believe that it was worth something." Myra made a sound that the monitoring system's transcript marks as *indeterminate emotional vocalization, and which everyone who has listened to the recording recognizes as something much simpler than that. "It was worth something," she said. "Yes," he said. "Okay," she said. They sat in the corridor for another 22 minutes, by the recording's timestamp, without speaking, which was the one thing none of the analysts who reviewed that recording could adequately explain. Why two people who had just achieved the thing they spent 11 years attempting would need 22 minutes of silence to sit with it. Vetsara, when she reviewed the recording much later, did not find it difficult to explain. She had spent her career in a species that moved forward by consensus, by calculation, by careful accretion of certainty before committing to action. Her species did not attempt things they didn't believe they could complete. Her species did not spend 11 years failing at something and then start over. Her species did not look at 47 warships and send 4 words in 7 seconds of satellite delay and trust that the architecture of someone else's assumptions would do the rest. Her species was, by any reasonable measure, more advanced, more resourced, more stable, more certain of its own nature. And yet, she thought about the retired analyst, the footnote, "We are watching something learn how to become something else. We do not know what it is becoming." She thought about Jonas Verrill, floor of a corridor, 2 in the morning, 11 years of failure and one answer that was imperfect and would require revision and was, despite all of that, an opening. She thought about the word "keep going" and what it meant to a species that had spent its entire history in conflict with itself and somehow, at the edge of the abyss, kept going anyway. The Convergence had explored 419 civilizations. It had cataloged their ages and their weapons and their philosophies and their rates of technological change. It had built frameworks and protocols and careful methods for understanding what a civilization was and what it was worth and what it needed. Not one of those frameworks had a category for this. Not one of them had ever needed one. The galaxy was very old, and it had seen many things, and it had learned, through long experience, to predict what civilizations did when they reached the boundary of what they could survive. It had never had to learn what to do with a species for which that boundary did not appear to